Happy late morning, West Coast, good afternoon, East Coast, and good evening to all of our friends in Europe. Welcome. I'm Lane Nooney. I'm a computer and video game historian in the Media Studies Department at New York University. And I'm also one of the co-founders and managing editor of ROMChip, a journal of game histories, who is hosting today's talk. I shepherd the journal alongside my amazingly talented collaborators and co-editors, Henry Lowood, Dave Parisi, Soraya Murray, and Logan Brown. Feel free to give a shout out for those of you who are here. And so whether you're new to ROMChip or you've heard me give this spiel 10 times, I always like to take a minute to remind folks what we stand for at ROMChip. So here's the deal. ROMChip is an open access hybrid audience online venue for the publication of game history. And what that means is, first, as a venue, we develop, solicit, edit, and publish work across a range of formats, from traditional peer-reviewed articles to interviews and oral histories to short essays and translations dealing with everything from video games to board games, analog games, sports, and play. As an open access journal, we have no paywall, no advertising, no logins, no predatory publishing model. You don't have to pay anything to read the research published in ROMChip ever. And so that is our unending commitment to you and to game history. Our authors keep their copyrights. We are trying to model a different kind of future for research publishing. And lastly, we call ourselves hybrid audience because we're trying to create a big tent around game history, a place where we can have rigorous historical engagement with as many people as possible who want to do that work. So part of our mission is that you shouldn't need a PhD to be able to write for or interview for or to read ROMChip. And these Twitch talks that we do, called ROMChip Presents, is an extension of that mission to bring historical work to you through the power of live streaming. This is also the first talk in a series of 3 we're hosting as part of our fundraising season, which very technically launches today. So next Friday, February 7th, same time, we'll be hosting Jesper Juhl for a talk about the much-loved Commodore 64. And the week after, on Valentine's Day, we'll be chatting with Braxton Soderman and Tom Bolsdorf about their new book on the Mattel in television. All those talks will be leading up to our second ever 12-hour Twitch fundraiser happening right here on February 22nd. Put it in your calendar right now, please. And why we want to make sure you don't miss that is because we need your support. ROMChip is a labor of love and commitment and dedication to sharing historical knowledge. We think it is powerful to be our own publisher, to be free from profit motives. And also, however, the thing about running a free journal with no ads that you don't charge anyone for is that we have no revenue. So some people might say, Lane, why would you do that? And I say it's because I believe in this community's capacity to recognize this work is valuable, to see how much fun we make happen, and to support this work. I think the past week has definitely made it completely clear that big institutions are not going to save us, universities are not going to save us, corporations and shrinking grant funds aren't going to protect the knowledge that we need to produce. But I think, as we learned last year, a legion of small donors can. So our goal on February 22nd is to raise at least $7,000, which will help us continue to bring all this incredible work. We've got a whole day of streaming content with folks like Jason Scott from the Internet Archive, game designers like Merritt Kay and Paolo Pedersini, Phil Salvador from the Video Game History Foundation, speedrunner Tina Hacks, Holly Nielsen, Sharon Biswas, Patrick Lemieux on the modular synth, Colleen Macklin talking about the trans vibrator. We even got the furry butt plug engineer QDOT, all right? It's going to be so stupid and you're going to love it, okay? So if that sounds awesome and you can't wait to join the fun, then the good news is you can help us right now. As of this moment, we are 25% toward our 7K goal with 22 days to go. Momentum matters a lot in the early days of a fundraiser, so the closer we get to 7K before February 22nd, the sooner we can unlock higher fundraising tiers, which allows us to do more cool stuff, which is actually secretly mostly just pay people to do more stuff. And as a bonus, every person who donates right now gets the early donor perk. You'll have your name enshrined on our donation site. You'll get a little ROMChip swag as a thank you. If you want to know more about our fundraising mission, or you just want to get to donating, we're going to drop those links in the chat. And with all that out of the way, it is my honor and my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Rachel Plotnick. Bring her on up. So Rachel Plotnick is an associate professor of cinema and media studies in the Media School at Indiana University, Bloomington. She studies human technology relationships and interfaces in everyday life, both historically and in the present. And if you want to know what that means, she gives a list of examples on her website, which includes everything from pushing buttons and scrolling through touchscreens to sweating in virtual reality headsets to cleaning vinyl records or dropping your phone in the toilet, the most relatable of human technology relationships. When I was explaining to someone earlier this week about Rachel's research, I said, this woman wrote a book about mechanical and digital buttons. This is so based. The book I'm referencing is her first work, Power Button, A History of Pleasure, Panic, and the Politics of Pushing, published by, that was a lot of P's, sorry, I got a little caught up for a second. Published by MIT Press in 2018. We've got a discount code in the chat if you'd like to pick it up. And she's got a new book coming out in April, also from MIT, called License to Spill, where dry devices meet liquid lives. When I heard Rachel had work on like gamer fuel, I knew we had to have her on here. It was like the history I didn't know I needed, but couldn't really wanted to learn everything about as soon as I knew it was an option. And not just because of the topic, but because Rachel is such a thoughtful and generous historian. Rachel, we are lucky to have you here. And with that, I'm going to get out of the way, crack some G Fuel, and let you get down to your talk.
Well, thank you so much. That was a wonderful welcome. I'm so pleased to be here and also to be supporting ROMChip. And I do encourage everyone to donate to their wonderful mission. It's really a treat to be here talking about this topic. I hope everyone brought their favorite beverage of choice. No judgments here today, whatever you brought. I can't actually see you anyway, so definitely no judgments. So I'm excited to tell you a little bit more about myself and my work. Actually, Lane probably did a better job than me, so I'm not sure I can add much more to that. But to just kind of reiterate, some of the topics that really interest me are just kind of these micro interactions that happen in everyday life around technology. I think we tend to focus on the big things, but I'm really interested in just the small ways that we go about our day using our devices. Specifically, I also like to think about where our bodies and devices meet in our environments. And so that gets into questions about messiness and hygiene, whether that's cleaning your screen or, as Lane mentioned, spilling on your computer or dropping in the toilet. And then I also like to think about these interesting kind of wormholes between past and present, how we might think about the past and present relating to each other. I think it's really fascinating when we can begin to make these connections that don't seem obvious at first. And hopefully my talk today will do that kind of work. As Lane mentioned, I'm also the author of Power Button, and I think buttons are this great example of, hey, we push them to play video games and ride in elevators and on social media and on our phones. Everything we do is kind of button-based today, and I wanted to understand how we became a society that pushes buttons. And then my newer work, which actually weirdly kind of fed into this discussion today about energy drinks, is called License to Spill, which really thinks about the relationship between liquids and technology. And I'm super excited that the cover for my book actually just was finished this week. So you are the very first people to see it, which I'm excited about, and will hopefully be up on the website soon. But this book's coming out April 29th. So the book kind of led me to this strange topic of thinking about media hygiene. And that might have been precipitated by the pandemic in some ways, but also because I have kids and they're just perpetually messy. And so am I. But also, I think I was just really interested in these questions of how we navigate care, maintenance, repair around our devices. And as I was looking at those questions and thinking about all these thresholds between smudges and spills and sweating and all of this gross stuff that happens between us and our technologies, what I began to notice was that also a lot of things were just happening around the idea of negotiating liquids in our everyday practices with technology. And one of the areas where I saw that coming about or popping up quite often was around the idea of the sort of power user, whether that was a gamer or a programmer, someone who tended to put drinks around their devices all the time. And I stumbled across this ad by Nintendo from the early 2000s that showed this kind of really messy, chaotic scene where food and drink and games mix. And I was really interested in the question of, when do we mix drinks and food with our technologies? And gaming seemed like a really interesting place to explore that. So that led me more to thinking about beverage cultures. Now, we can talk about drinks in a lot of different ways, whether it's productivity, and of course, coffee and the caffeine associated with that is probably the most iconic beverage that we think of when it comes to what we do in the workplace, although obviously it has a lot of other connotations around comfort and pleasure and leisure and all these other things. We can also think about beverage cultures in relation to entertainment and to a much longer history of media, right? Thinking about soda in the movies, for example, having quite a long kind of entwining relationship. And there are other kinds of beverage cultures that I'll be talking about more today that relate to sport and performance as well. Obviously, this is very much ingrained not only in our practices, but also in a really massive kind of economy around who makes and manufactures beverages, who buys them. And the booming economy of this industry is of particular interest to me as well. When I was looking at the idea of the power user and what it takes to kind of really get drinks into these environments and get people stay up all night coding or playing games all night, obviously energy drinks is one of the first things that kind of came to mind. And the energy drink industry is massive. It's grown tremendously over the last couple of decades. And of course, this doesn't include gaming. There are many various subcultures around this, as well as different kinds of products, whether that's drinks or powders, shots, lots of different products. This is a absolutely massive market. It's expected to reach $125 billion by 2030, which to me wasn't that surprising when you begin to look at the shelves of supermarkets and see people around drinking these things all the time. So I started to kind of poke around and think about how might we approach this topic? What could we do with it? And I began looking at all the things that people have written about and said about the question of energy drinks, specifically as they relate to gaming. And there's a lot out there. The number one thing that people tend to talk about the most is public health. They'll talk about often the massive amounts of sugar quantity in these drinks, as well as high degrees of caffeine, especially a youthful population who tends to consume these. And often really kind of deriding them as this big public health problem, and it's bad for people to drink them, and predatory companies that make them and convince people to drink them, right? So there's usually this pretty negative association that comes about when people are talking about the public health problems that arise from this, similar to how we might think about soda consumption more generally. A second area that people have talked about is thinking about the role of energy drinks in gamer culture specifically. There are a lot of stereotypes that circulate around gamers, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, around junk food culture, that gamers only eat bad food, that they sit in their basement consuming all this bad stuff. But people have also written about kind of the pleasure and ritual around these kinds of beverages and food, that they often bring people together in different contexts, that they can kind of construct identity as well as reflect identity, and that becomes part of the broader culture of gaming that we might think about. Another area from which this has been tackled is thinking about the massive role of marketing and sponsorship in terms of energy drinks and gaming. Lots of influencers hawk these different kinds of products. You can see lots of in-game placements that sell these beverages when you're playing a game. Lots of these companies have been known to even go to game events and conferences and places where gamers go, right, and tap into that market. So there's a very, very tight relationship here in terms of the business aspect of this, and how they're advertised, even branding different drinks in terms of the game that you might play or special releases and things like that. And then the last area is a lot of research has looked at kind of the sport or physiology around this, thinking about, well, do energy drinks actually work? Do they make us more effective in terms of our reaction time or our performance? And in esports in particular, this is where you see the most research being done. Some of this research is sponsored by companies like Red Bull. I think even Cornell even has a lab where they'll use these drinks and try to test out people's reaction time. So that's kind of on the more physiological, scientific end, trying to figure out the actual merits of these drinks. Now, I'm actually not going to really deal with any of these things, so you might be disappointed to find that out, but I wanted to kind of approach this topic from a very, very different angle, of course, being informed by all these things that have been said in the past. So how might we think about this topic from a really sort of quirky perspective, I guess, and I tend to approach media technologies maybe from, angles that people aren't typically thinking of. And so for me, one of the things I wanted to begin to poke into was trying to link energy drinks to a broader history around fatigue and sleep and tiredness. And a lot of people have written about that, the pressures of staying awake in our culture, kind of living in a 24/7 capitalistic culture. What does it mean to drink something so that you don't have to go to sleep and you can stay awake, kind of fighting the body's instincts in certain ways? I also wanted to place energy drinks within a broader discussion around binging and media marathoning. Again, often having a negative connotation, what it means to binge or to do something too much. And lots of discussions around media marathoning happen around television, Netflix. But I was interested in thinking beyond that and kind of applying some of that thinking to games specifically, which doesn't tend to come up very much in a lot of the conversations that happen around kind of lengthy gaming and mixing that with beverage cultures. And then the third area is around performance and wellness. What can energy drinks tell us about impulses to increase one's performance, to perform better, to think about one's body as being well or supplemented in various ways? And so what I try to do in the remaining talk here is to think about these first two topics, fatigue and sleep, and media marathoning, as a kind of endurance, right? What does it mean to endure for a long period of time while playing a game? And then over time, how has that gotten married with performance in a more sporting sense to lead to what I call this kind of media optimization and to optimize people's bodies in order to play longer and better, right? That's kind of at least the claim that's being made. And again, I'm not kind of here to adjudicate whether this actually works or not, but I'm interested in kind of the way these claims play out in culture and history over time. This idea of optimization is really fascinating to me. There's a really nice scholarly journal issue that just kind of talks about all these different issues related to optimization. And Fenwick, McKelvey, and Joshua Neves talk about this idea of optimizing practices that we go through in our lives, not even necessarily having to do with any one topic like energy drinks, but that users aim to enhance their own lives in work, play, physical health, mental and emotional performance, relationships, sex, and much else. And that ultimately optimization can tell us a lot about our bodies, about labor and productivity, and self-actualization. So we could start to think a little bit more about questions of what it means to optimize oneself, particularly for play and in order to participate in different communities or to have potentially a more pleasurable experience while gaming. So I'm going to kind of walk through these different areas that I just talked about: fatigue, sleep, media marathoning, and performance and wellness. My goal is not by any means to give kind of a full or complete history of how we might think of the history of energy drinks. There's a lot of work to be done there, and this talk won't do that. But I'm trying to, I think, take more of a quilting approach or pastiche approach, where I'm trying to bring together a lot of different things to hopefully put them in tension and kind of help us think a little bit more deeply about this topic. So we'll start with fatigue and sleep. I was really fascinated in 1913 about tests that were being done on pilots to figure out if they could fly better while drinking alcohol, and troops as well. Obviously, things that have happened this week regarding flying and crashes and accidents is really tragic. And actually, I think some of the things I'll be saying today are sort of in dialogue with that in terms of thinking about the pressures that are put on people to stay awake and to perform well under often very different conditions. It may not be surprising to you to find out that when you give troops alcohol, they don't actually perform better, right? Conclusively, they did better when they were given water than when they were given alcohol. But early on, there was this question of what kind of beverage might get people to perform as their best selves. Now, we can kind of interrogate what best selves mean, but the idea here was around endurance. How much could a troop endure given the different kinds of things that they were taking into their bodies? Now, this wasn't just a matter of the military, but that was a common place where people thought about this, and lots of different drinks were kind of pitched as maybe the ideal drink. So here we have malted milk. I'm not exactly sure what that tasted like, but there's the idea here in Britain of Captain Sir John Alcock, who completed a successful transatlantic flight while drinking this malted milk, and supposedly it made his flight go that much smoother. He was able to stay awake that much longer. Ovaltine, if you're familiar with that beverage, was also another one that was advertised as having these kind of amazing health benefits in terms of nerve force and sustenance, whatever that might mean. But again, the idea was really around creating an energetics of endurance, that one could fly longer and perform better with these kinds of drinks. Now, why am I making a connection between energy drinks and pilots, for example? I think one of the interesting things that happens is trying for me to imagine what does it mean to sort of be in a seated position, being in a fixed space for a period of time, trying to focus often visually, but also tactily on a lot of things that are happening around you. And a lot of the things that happen in piloting in terms of controls and attention seem to me to have quite a lot to do with gaming. I think there's some interesting parallels there. Another, I don't know if I want to call this a food or a drink, but another product, Nox Gelatine, this is gelatin, think akin to Jello, was a powder that you would mix in with fruit drink. And it was also proclaimed to have a lot of health benefits for people who were tired. So this was beyond kind of the pilot or someone in an aircraft. But they were pitched as sort of trying to help the tired American, right? And I think, as probably many of us are very tired, we've seen these kinds of discussions before. We've seen a lot of products that are levied at people who are purportedly tired and need some kind of remedy to deal with that. One, dad seems to have lost his verve. How can we get it back? He can drink this disgusting gelatin. What's fascinating about this is it was debunked very early on. I guess they claimed that amino acids within this product were supposed to give people more energy. They did a test on 10 people and then tried to make these arguments, but they didn't seem deterred by the fact that all scientific evidence pointed against it. They continued to really kind of pitch this drink as being the solution to people's problems. We see the problem of fatigue becoming more acute during World War II. And particularly that's when you begin to see people using all different kinds of drugs, particularly amphetamine, to stay awake while they're flying. This is a book called Your Body in Flight, put out by the United States Army, which was warning about, the negative effects that can come from not just caffeine, but benzodrine, which is an amphetamine, that they're hard to take, they're habit forming, and they're likely to lead you worse off after the effects have passed. So there's a lot of pressure on these pilots and troops to stay awake, and were often using whatever they needed to do it. And a lot of literature was being put out to say, hey, this is dangerous, please don't do this. But I was kind of fascinated by this passage that the Air Force wrote in 1945, where they talk about just the pressures of the visual and attentional demands of being a pilot. Give yourself navigation and cruise control problems on which your very life depends. Watch continuously for enemy aircraft and shipping. And by the way, think of the target and what the enemy may do if you make a mistake. And don't forget to put on a Mae West, your pistol belt with the old 45, 2 canteens full of water, your jungle knife, jungle kit, first aid kit, and wear GI boots so you can walk through the jungle if necessary. Now put on a radio headset for 7 hours and never stop listening to screaming, howling static, and piercing calls from radio stations. And be continuously alert for calls from your leaders or fellow pilots. So we can see here the strain in terms of the demands for attention and even just the physical, physiological kind of stresses that were put upon these pilots. And if I sort of imagine what it would be like to play a video game where you're doing all of these things in simulation form and trying to stay awake to do that, I think there are some really interesting parallels there. It's maybe not as different as it seems. Lindbergh famously, when he took his flight in 1927, was warned by his doctor that he might fall asleep during the flight. And he said, I never drink coffee. So his doctor advised that he take grains of caffeine with him so that he, in case he needed them, would be able to fly properly. And then later in the 50s and 60s, this would lead to products like NoDoz, which probably many of you are familiar with. And that would extend to driving as well as flying. The idea of energy lift at any altitude. I'm interested in this kind of drowsy view versus the NoDoz view, that we can't see properly or take in the things around us without these kind of pep pills. And the idea is that coffee itself isn't enough, but how can we turn this into some kind of supplementation that people can take in order to get through the activities that they need to get through? Now, this, of course, then leads us, you're probably like, where are the energy drinks in all of this? But here they come, right? So if we start to look at the 1980s, there's a rise in kind of alternatives to traditional soda, alternatives to Pepsi and Coca-Cola. Jolt Cola is probably one of the most iconic drinks that took on a larger than life role, I think, within the gaming community. And you can see here that there isn't an emphasis on health or wellness by any stretch of the imagination. And in fact, this was a passage from a book where the Jolt company president explicitly said, this was never intended to be a health food, that what we're trying to do here is give you a burst of energy through caffeine. And we don't really care if it's good for you or not. That was sort of never the point. The idea here, though, is around energetics and that you'll be awake and more energetic for longer if you drink this beverage. This extends then into the 90s and 2000s, where we see a lot of advertising and ideas around avoiding sleep, right? Balls being one of the most famous early drinks to catch on, that often sponsored LAN parties and was very immersed in the culture of gaming early on, not recommended for people who need their beauty sleep, right? And this idea, I think, of avoiding sleep within gaming culture becomes a very popular one. This was a 2015 passage from an Xbox magazine. The Xbox One is becoming the only home for the player that subscribes to the notion that sleep is for babies. Gamers play all night. And I'm really fascinated by that idea of gaming culture as being all-night culture, and that avoiding sleep is one of the primary ways to enjoy gaming. Fast forwarding to the present, we can see that a lot of companies, this one is called 9mm Energy, talk about the importance of caffeine. And in this passage here, they say that this will allow you to have resistance to sleep, which is really beneficial for gamers, right? So this idea that to be a great gamer, you need to be able to stay awake for longer. And then I was sort of tickled by this Threads post that was up just a few days ago. When you need energy drinks to stay up gaming past 8 p.m., anybody else when you're over 30. And so there's also an idea of whose body needs this kind of supplementation or augmentation, what kind of body is most fit or prepared to play games. And if you feel like you don't have that ability or you don't fall into that kind of youthful, energetic body, then you need some kind of supplementation to be able to pull this off. I wanted to put this in dialogue with some literature out there, and a lot of people have written, as I said, on kind of thinking about sleep and time and the demands of productivity in our culture. I'm particularly inspired by Hu's book on digital lethargy, where he particularly talks about this being a problem of the digital age, of feeling fatigue or burnout or boredom, that probably many of us would describe as being this kind of byproduct of digital capitalism. And that what digital capitalism does is it promises to turn even unproductive moments into productive ones. And certainly we can see how this is not unique to the digital in the sense of computers, that for a long time there's been kind of this capitalistic drive to avoid fatigue, to get people to work longer and more efficiently, to keep them awake for more hours so that they can be more productive. And in the long term, that's kind of added up into this productivity and endurance culture that can be very taxing and draining on people. And I wonder sometimes about the relationship then between play and fatigue, and how those two things intersect with one another. So this then leads into thinking more about media marathoning and binging, if we use that term, even though it's got kind of that negative slant. If we ask, okay, well, why are gamers staying up all night? Why are these imperatives to game for longer? For some people, of course, there just isn't time to game during the day, and the night hours might be the only time when people can set aside what else they have to do and have the time to play. But there's also the idea of playing for longer, and that the game, or many games, demand this kind of constant attention and many hours of play in order to master them. We could use many examples of this, but this was an interesting one where someone talks about a game being particularly addictive and complex. They can't put it down and stop. It's the perfect all-nighter game, right? The idea that some games are suited for playing all night. There's always just one more thing to do, one more piece of ground to take, one more resource to build. It just goes on and on. And I think the idea of it being horribly addictive is that the person doesn't like this, but also they can't stop. And we might put this in tension then with thinking about how more and more games are designed to be played for longer. They're not easy to pick up and put down within a few minutes of time, the way maybe a smartphone game is compared to console play. Here's another one from 2000 where someone talks about being a Warcraft-aholic. It started with the odd game here and there, a couple at lunch and then a couple after work, but it didn't take long before I started binging. They talk about it being embroiled in hazy all-nighter sessions. Weekends disappeared faster than a tub of lard at a fat club. That's quite an analogy. And they talk about kind of this addiction worsening, this 24 hours a day desire to play. Now, I'm sure that this doesn't describe everybody who plays games, but both of them use this kind of language of addiction and binging, which we see playing out in terms of how people talk about television as well. So there's this kind of negative connotation associated with it. But at the same time, as I'll talk about, there's also this imperative to keep playing, and that's kind of a measure of your mettle and your ability to keep going. And that's a positive thing as well as a negative thing. So it kind of straddles these two connotations of being good to do and bad to do at the same time. In the present moment, we see a lot of people writing on forums about how can I build endurance in gaming? I can't play more than 2 to 3 games at a time. My brain just shuts down from exhaustion, but I'm hoping to get to more hours. Is there a way for me to play for longer? I often see people that can play for 8 to 10 hours a day. I think, we use the term now grinding. My son likes to use this term. And if we think about streamers and people who are on for hours and hours a day, right, this expectation that you have to be able to go for a long time. And Red Bull specifically speaks to this. They have this page on their website that was published in 2018, 7 proven tricks to pull an all-night gaming session. We're not propagating staying up all night, but sometimes you need to push through, right? And so there's this kind of ambivalence around, hey, maybe this isn't good for you, but don't you want to be able to do it if you need to? And I think most people would acknowledge that they don't think they're necessarily doing what's best for their body, but that they have reasons why they might do it anyway. When we look at how energy drink companies then connect this to the idea of the media marathon, they're really specifically speaking to that, right? This one says that you can power through the longest streams and most competitive matches, experience a surge in energy level for stamina that lasts game after game. The idea of stamina comes up repeatedly for a lot of these companies. This particular one says that every second counts, and they pitch it specifically that gaming fits into all the other things that you need to do, like going to the gym or being at work, that every second of your day counts, and therefore don't you want to be able to optimize your time effectively. The idea of not crashing, then, this product is called No Lag. They say you can power through your day, right? And I was inspired by that idea of powering through. What does it mean to power the human body as we're also trying to power ourselves in a particular game? This also extends beyond drink or beverage cultures specifically. So, for example, furniture companies that make products for gaming, like gaming chairs, every gamer knows that you'll last longer with more armor. That idea of lasting longer, I think, is particularly provocative and interesting, but also just trying to think about what are the conditions that a body will perform the best in for the longest. So we see here how Lisa Perks talks about this in terms of media marathoning is a conjoined triumph of commitment and stamina. This is specifically more about television, but we can see the same kind of thing resonating here, that the marathon is not a mindless indulgence, but rather it's this commitment to keeping going, right? And that people will do anything, even forego bathroom breaks or sleep in order to be able to keep going. And so I call this a kind of endurance work that maybe is not so different than how we might think of marathon running or climbing mountains. When people talk about endurance work in terms of physical effort, it's the ability to keep going physically and mentally in the face of pain, discomfort, and suffering, but that it becomes a celebrated cultural practice. Like, it almost becomes cool to say, oh yeah, I was able to stay up all night, or I was able to play for 10 hours straight. And then people brag about that and even desire to be able to achieve that. So this endurance work is something that's painful and yet good in that way. And these companies play into that concept. The third category, as I mentioned, is performance and wellness. And this, I think, is where things get very interesting, because if historically the idea of the energy drink was kind of as a junk food and people acknowledged it was bad for you and you did it even though you knew you felt kind of bad doing it, there's been a real turn in the industry over time around performance and wellness. And here's where I want to kind of connect this more broadly to thinking about sport and performance and how that's kind of taken over the industry over the last decade or so. So if we go back and look historically, again, lots of drinks have been pitched at athletes of various kinds, like drinking barley water, again, like malted milk. I don't really know what that's about. It seems a little bit disturbing to me. But the idea is that it will impart great sustenance and stamina. Here's one for cocoa, and it's pitched at a boy in school sports who can be healthful and invigorated. I think it's probably no surprise to say at this point that there are gendered connotations to a lot of what we see too around the ideas of stamina and endurance that have a particularly kind of male slant to them and are often pitched to people who are in male occupations historically, or are kind of pitched as the ideal kind of consumer of these beverages, right? And then this has continued on historically. If we look at products like Gatorade, especially, and Powerade, that have targeted athletes, that promise to give you better performance if you drink them, that they'll give you the edge against your competition, or even products like power bars and all different kinds of nutritional supplements and snacks that are all designed around the idea of the performing body and the ideal performer. This plays out similarly then, even if we look at in the 70s and 80s around arcade players. Here someone's talking about drinking colas, 2 16-ounce colas 30 minutes before your performance at the arcade. You're going to feel really bad. You might end up with a terminal case of arcade cancer from drinking too much soda, but hey, maybe it'll give you that edge at the arcade, right? What's interesting over time, as I mentioned, is that we begin to see a shift toward healthfulness and wellness as being the predominant narrative or the rhetoric that we see. Now, Gamma Labs is the company. Originally, they were in the business of making male supplements like testosterone boosters, as you see here, and performance enhancement. They're the company that ended up actually making G Fuel. And so it's very interesting that they ultimately did a pivot toward gaming. But you can see here kind of this pitch toward the ideal male physique and peak performance. Gaming magazines start talking about this in the 2000s. What will make people super gamers? These are pills called microcharge. Again, not all that different than how we can think about amphetamines and pilots much, much earlier. Here's another article from 2008 about drugs for gamers. In competitive gaming, people turn to an arsenal of sources for improving their game. As we see then, the idea around competitiveness and then game as sport becomes something that is more predominant. And in the present moment, if we look at the different types of products that are available, they really pitch performance as a kind of sport, right? So this idea of refreshing and refueling, eye health, reaction time, energy, focus, that you're not just trying to stay awake, but you're trying to boost all cognitive aspects, reaction time, your performance on a much more broad physiological level. Lots of supplements now have different kinds of additives to them. I don't know how to pronounce this, if it's nootropics, nootropics. I looked it up. Apparently the internet doesn't agree on this topic. But there's different efforts to kind of figure out, to what extent can we put different sources of herbal supplements into these products. And this emphasis on health is something that's become a lot more predominant. Zero sugar, no fillers, that there are vitamins and minerals. You would think if you saw this that it wasn't pitched at a gamer, but the idea of nerd focus or gamer supplements has become something that's sort of taken over the industry in recent years. This fits into kind of a broader dynamic around the idea of supplements in our culture, where people feel like they can become active agents of wellness. This kind of exists outside of the broader medical establishment, right? It's kind of alternative medicine, just like people buy vitamins or protein powder or things like that, but that you can do something actively to take care of yourself and to make yourself better, rather than kind of being at the mercy of the medical system. And I think it also then plays into this kind of medicalization of everyday life, where we're kind of diagnosing ourselves and figuring out what are my ailments and what can I do to sort of fix them through products that I can purchase. So where all of this then leads us is to, as I head back to the beginning of my talk, is what I would call this kind of media optimization, where these products are designed to arrange and orient our bodies to effectively endure and consume, right? To make us better consumers. And over time, I see this historical trajectory of taking endurance and performance and putting them together. But I think we can start to ask then some critical questions about, what does it mean to be optimized? Is that always a good thing to be? And when does this desire for endurance and performance kind of interfere with our ability to actually enjoy play? When is it constructive versus destructive? We can think about whose bodies are affected by this. I think there are a lot of implications in terms of thinking about ability and disability, and when to give into fatigue or our bodies feeling badly versus to ignore those signs, and what might be some of the potential costs of orienting the gaming industry around this kind of logic around health, wellness, and performance. So I will end there, but I would absolutely love to take your questions, and this work is still in progress, so I'd appreciate any feedback that you have. Thank you so much.
All right. Oh, yeah, and here I am. Hey, thank you so much, Rachel. Folks, drop your questions in the chat while I just chat a little with Rachel. There's so many thoughts. That was really great. I was thinking when you were doing that kind of history of fatigue and supplementation at the beginning, it was reminding me a lot of reading the kind of first-person accounts of computer programmers in the 70s and 80s, right? That there's not a consumer market around these things, but it's definitely part of the phenomena, right? Like Steve Wozniak names his first computer the cream soda computer, because that was what he was drinking. Him and his friend Bill Fernandez were drinking when they made it, right? That there's this kind of producer culture orientation to this that then becomes commodified, I guess, by the time we reach the 80s. That's just a kind of observation. I was very curious if you have ever, like, as part of your research, do you try these supplements?
So that's a great question. To your previous point, I think you're absolutely right. Like even the fact that Java programming is called Java, right? Like around coffee, I think is just so embedded in the culture, and that in and of itself is really fascinating. The idea of the power user, and that it's a good thing to be able to stay up all night and code, or that it leads to inspiration or these productivity binges or things like that. I don't. My husband is an avid drinker of these beverages, so they're always around my house, and I'm just really kind of fascinated by their labels and their colors and their flavors. I mean, Starburst makes these drinks. I mean, they're literally everywhere now. But as I was getting ready for today, I was thinking to myself, it would be really interesting to do kind of a sensory study of this, where we think about flavor and taste changing over time. A lot of people talk about some of these early ones, like, Balls or Red Bull, or as tasting terrible, and that people would hate them but drink them anyway because they wanted the benefits from them. But over time, it seems like there's an effort to make them taste good. And I think that's kind of maybe an interesting question to probe further around just what does performance taste like, right? A weird question.
No, that's an amazing question. I don't consume gamer energy drinks, but I do. I weightlift, and so I am I have to intersect with the powder protein industrial complex, which is going through a very similar sort of phenomena where it's 5,000 giant plastic tubs of stuff that is promising to taste like Fruity Pebbles, and you're like, yeah, that's definitely the most mask flavor profile I could possibly imagine, right? Is for my protein powder to taste like cotton candy. Like, what the fuck's wrong with you? And it's a similar, I think that stuff used to taste terrible. And part of the rebranding of it is this kind of colorful-ification of the consumption. We've got a couple questions in the chat. So Matt Knutson is here, and he asks, in the instance of esports, would you say there is a bait and switch going on between the stated optimization of play and the effect of the optimization of consumption?
I might need a little more detail on that question. Can you say a little bit more, Matt?
While Matt types that in,
yes,
I will go to another question by Billy. Did you find different brands being associated with different kinds of games and genres? And they're saying what comes to mind for me is the white monster archetype of gamer I always see get made fun of on social media.
That's a great question. Yeah. I think there are different kinds of branding happening. If we think of Mountain Dew and G Fuel and some of these more maybe OG kind of ones that have branded toward gaming, they tend to emphasize the games themselves. They'll often put characters on the cans. They're very embedded sometimes in the gameplay itself, or kind of speaking to the community. Whereas I think some of these newer products are moving away from that. They tend to have a lot of either Japanese or anime type animation on them, bright colors, being pitched more as these health drinks. So I do think there's some stratification happening where some things are, targeted more at the kind of commercial gamer or recognizable brands and products, and others are about thinking maybe more toward this kind of sport, health, wellness. And so there is some diversity there, I think, in the way that these products are differentiating themselves.
Yeah, where does something like Prime fit into this? I feel like because of the sort of because it's Logan Paul's brand, right? The sort of YouTube masculinization politics there are very apparent, and it feels like one of those brands that has gotten really popular because of YouTube, which is a disturbing phenomena to see inside your grocery store.
Yeah, it's like a whole other wing of this. And it's kind of fascinating to think about the way that these different media cultures are spawning their own consumption cultures. And one of the things that got me interested in this topic originally was thinking about when we say media consumption, what are we actually consuming? And we're not just consuming the content anymore. We're also consuming food and drinks. And I think it's becoming more and more interlaced in, how we think about YouTube or games or this or that.
All right. Matt has followed up.
Thank you, Matt.
Yay! He says, the drinks are telling players that they can optimize their play, perform better, win more, achieve higher ranks, go pro. by consuming these products. Whereas in effect, the drink is making them buy more, buy an addictive drink, stay in the game longer, consume more in-game items. Perhaps the question is kind of like, one, it's a bait and switch, but is there a kind of community cognizance of this? Like where, is there any kind of address of this whether in the kind of user culture or any thoughts you have that, I guess, particularly at the sort of esports pro performance level?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm really fascinated by it because while I was doing this project, I started researching more into Gatorade, and I read this really interesting article in the British Medical Journal about Gatorade that even the idea of thirst is kind of contentious. And in fact, Gatorade sort of rebranded thirst and basically made people say, you don't actually know when you're thirsty. You have to drink even when you think you're not thirsty. And before that, the science always said, drink when you're thirsty. If you don't feel thirsty, don't worry about it. And there really isn't a lot of great science to support Gatorade's claim that, drink all the time, whether you feel thirsty or not. But they've built an entire massive industry around that, right? I think a similar thing has happened around esports where even though the science isn't necessarily there to support it, it is increasingly part of the culture. And because you have a lot of, I think even academic industry partnerships that are happening now trying to test out like, hey, if we give this person Red Bull, will they perform better? It does this legitimizing work to make it seem like these products are legitimate while not really paying attention to the negative health effects or the addictive effects. I think people within the gaming industry themselves, gamer culture or game users themselves probably are pretty savvy, right? I don't think a lot of people are hoodwinked like, this is really good for me and I should be drinking this, right? Like I doubt that that's, the predominant attitude. But you see a lot of people asking online, does this work? Does it not? Is it a good idea? Is it a bad idea? And I think there is some real ambiguity there because the science just isn't developed enough to say one way or the other.
Yeah. And there's so much overwhelming marketing around it. Consort in the chat, who's an esports coach, is saying that it's something they talk about their students with a lot, that, these drinks are not going to help them play well longer, but like you can extend time, but performance drops, right? Logan is here too. Logan Brown says, your talk reminded me of a number of friends I have who stay up all night drinking energy drinks, not to game more effectively, but because they seem to they see that as somehow recouping time for themselves outside of work. For them, this is a kind of act of resistance against work productivity. How do you see maybe the evolution of these beverages corresponding to changing attitudes towards leisure specifically?
I think that's a super great question. And hi, Logan. I certainly think that we can see that element of resistance there that, and I'm certainly, I think, responsive to that idea that it's like, if this is the only time that you can do it, how can you steal time back? But to me, that ultimately does feed into kind of this digital capitalistic like feeling of burnout. And, my guess is that the people who stay up all night playing and drinking energy drinks in the morning when they have to go back to work don't feel great, right? Yeah. And so ultimately, like, yeah, maybe you're resisting a little bit, but in the broader narrative of your life, it's probably contributing even more maybe to that feeling of burnout. And I think the fact that people have to be forced to staying up all night to do what they enjoy, right? That's a problem in and of itself. So I think it's more of a symptom of this broader kind of cultural problem rather than a solution to it. As far as the history goes over time, I haven't kind of studied how people have used drinks maybe to steal time back in that way more broadly. But I think that, people have often talked about coffee as a social drug. If we think about alcohol and people at bars and what they do in their leisure time, right? There's a really long history of trying to use drinks as an elixir against the forces of one's drudgery, right? But whether that actually is a salve for these problems, again, I think probably not so much.
Wow, now we got a bunch of questions. One, McMahon asks, is the rise of energy drinks partly powered by youths rejecting coffee as a tool to endure longer tasks or work because it was so standard among a previous generation? I guess the question would be, is there anything in your research that indicates a kind of preferential move amongst a younger consumer base, that like Gen Z is just like too locked in for coffee, you know?
I don't have research to support that either way. My intuition says that you're probably right, that I think these are specifically marketed at a younger generation. And, you know, if we think of the different associations that people have with different kinds of beverages, coffee has a real workplace association with it. You know, you drink coffee at work, and it has that kind of white collar idea. And so I think the idea of putting this in a can, of making it brightly colored, of marketing it to people who play games and stream and do things that an older generation might not understand or know anything about, that, yeah, my intuition says that this is very much part of the way that the industry has tried to differentiate itself from coffee. But I even do see there's this company called Control now and a few others that are trying to brand coffee as energy drinks, where they're trying to make it cool and put it in a can. So I think we're already moving in that moment of trying to rebrand coffee in that way.
Okay, yeah, we're already there. Yeah, you're right. It's like coffee is not play, right? Coffee is for doing like adult work,
Coffee's
right?
work.
Yeah. Myron asks, you know, obviously in the 90s, early 2000s, there's a flood of kind of hypersexualized advertisements in gaming magazines, right? That's where we get the kind of primary address of the gamer as the young male. And, you know, that implied that being a good competitive gamer gives you a sexual advantage as well. This is a theme, obviously, that you see a lot in ads from the time. And the question is kind of, what kind of work is the word stamina maybe doing in the present or lasting longer for energy drinks that tries to kind of tap into these marketing ideas, maybe in a way that's attempting to be perhaps somewhat more subtle than it was in the past.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very astute observation. And I was laughing to myself the other day that maybe all of the things I write about are about sex without actually realizing it. You know, I buttons and turn-ons for a long time, and then I got into liquids, and now we're over here on drinks. But I think they are pretty thinly veiled messages, you know, and even these much earlier ads that I showed around, you know, stamina and vigor and sustenance. And I think there is the idea of male vitality there for sure. And, you know, these kind of plays on lasting longer, even, you know, I can't imagine that these connections aren't being made, you know, among the companies who are doing this kind of work. And I think it feeds into that overall message of what does it mean to be vital and have stamina. And this is, you know, very ableist when we think too about which bodies are able to play for so many hours, or which bodies can keep going and last longer. And I mean, in some ways they're telling us nobody can. You need supplementation. You're not good enough on your own without it, right? But on the other hand, there is kind of this ideal body that's going to benefit from it the most, and everyone else is kind of left behind in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I will cap off on this last question by False Beard. They say, just tuned in, but it seems like a lot of the current state of gaming-related energy drinks are designed to focus on promoting in-game proficiency and productivity. Have you happened to find any, let's say, kind of consumables, energy drinks or anything else that are for kind of like creativity in game? That this may be, the example they give is like, this may be a bad example, but something like taking edibles to make music or art, right? That there's a very different kind of, I guess, chain of consumption that happens around other kinds of critical practices. And is gaming just about the obsession with kind of stamina and performance, right? Even though that is such a subset of what gaming is, even, you know, it's like, I'm not drinking this to play Stardew Valley. Like, what do we, you know?
I think that's a fascinating question. I haven't seen anything around creativity. And I think, you know, your question in conversation with what Lane just said, you know, really does make me think that the metrics by which we define good play have been really narrowly defined. You know, so much of it is around reaction time and speed and stamina. And that implies a really specific kind of play and a really specific kind of game. I haven't seen much of anything in the way of, you know, play more creatively or think outside the box or let your mind run wild. You know, maybe that will be the next kind of evolution or iteration that we see in these. They're always going to find a new way to brand them, right?
Yeah. What happens when we run out of this agenda?
Yeah. Then it'll be Starburst energy drinks for creativity. You know, that's going to be the next the next thing in the line. So I'll be curious to see if that kind of comes to fruition, but that really does speak to where the industry has kind of placed its efforts to this point.
Oh my God. I feel like there's a ton more questions that we could have. We could continue this conversation for a while, but I kind of have to let everybody go. Before folks bounce, let me just say, reminder, next week, same bat time, same bat place. We're going to have Jesper Juhl on talking about his new book about the Commodore 64. And then on April 14th, we will have a talk about the Mattel in television. Certainly, Rachel, if folks would like to stay on top of your work or learn more, how should they find you?
Yeah, I've got a website, rachelplotnick.com, or you can search for me at Indiana University Media School. And I'm always happy to talk to people more about these topics or other things. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. And if you want to check out Rachel's other book, Power Button, we've got a MIT press code, read MIT 20 here in the chat that you can make use of. Thanks, everybody. Game on. See you next week.